Welcome, Scholastics, Faith and Reason. In this video, we'll be doing like we've been doing, an overview of the handout for this week. The first thing we can note is we have the same sort of structure we've had for the past few weeks with these core questions. The major questions for this week are questions that attracted a lot of attention during what's referred to as the Middle Ages or the medieval period or era in history. Namely, can we use human reason, like our ability to think systematically, very carefully about things, even though our knowledge may be limited? Can we, work our way to support or proof or, for various articles of faith? That during the medieval period, you had Christianity and the Christian worldview or the Christian spiritual worldview is in play to a wide extent in the Western world. And what happens is the majority of philosophy is occurring within various religious institutions or places of worship. You have your clergymen, your monks. They're the ones doing the philosophy at the time. They're the ones that are able to read the most and write, and they have a lot of time. So they're the ones that are doing philosophical work. Not the only ones, but the overwhelming majority of them. And what they came to be called in time, they wouldn't necessarily have called themselves this, but not all of them would have. But that's the notion of scholastics. It's really just medieval or middle-aged clergymen, monks, people that are associated with the church in some kind of way and Christianity in some kind of way that are doing philosophy in a very particular systematic way focused on argumentation. What can human reason do? And it's put toward a lot of questions, but a lot of it was put toward these questions of faith. Like, for example, does God exist? Well, by default, the Christians at the time would say, yes, of course God exists, the adopters of the Christian spiritual worldview. But the challenge is, can we use human reason to actually develop really good and structurally sound and valid argumentation to, in a sense, prove that God exists? There's many means of proof, and we'll talk about that in this video. But the key to it is just an extremely compelling argument that if one hears it and they understand it, would it indeed serve to say, yes, there's very little way to doubt that God exists. And that was a key component. It was a very significant part of what the scholastics, the sort of medieval philosophy people, were up to. So we will do that throughout this handout. Let's look at them. But first, before we do that, let's historically orient ourselves, like we always try to do. Is that last week we saw the sort of rise of Christianity inside the Roman Empire. And the way that it played out is pretty straightforward, is that you have Jesus is born, he lives, does various miracles, says various things. Those things are written down, recorded. Then Jesus is crucified, and the events, they're either written down during or after the crucifixion, and then the resurrection, and then those teachings, what Jesus said, his sermons, those are transmitted throughout the Roman Empire. And they're transmitted by, for example, Paul going all over the place, using the Roman roads, the Roman boats and trade system all around the Mediterranean Sea. And eventually the Christianity and Christians, it becomes very prevalent throughout the Roman Empire, especially the western part of it. And it becomes to such a degree that Christians just start outnumbering all the other tradition, the other belief systems. And they do a lot of apologetics. They create argumentation to try to defend Christianity against the so-called pagans. Well, pagan is just a word that means, at this time, it was basically any sort of non-Christian, non-Jewish sort of person. It would have been someone that was a polytheist, believed in multiple gods, whether it's the Greek gods or it's the Roman rendition of such, whatever. It could have been nature spirits. It didn't matter. It's just that it was the Christians versus the pagans in terms of argumentation. And eventually the Christian numbers in Rome increased to such an extent that Constantine in 316 legalizes Christianity, which doesn't completely stop all the persecutions. Initially, Rome tried to, Christianity was fine, but then Rome discovers that Christians are not necessarily going to go along with everything that Rome wants in terms of the Roman government and the emperors. They put a lot of emphasis on almost being like gods themselves or the descendants of gods. And so, in a sense, when you're participating in Roman religious rituals, you're kind of paying worship to the emperor too. And that was something the Christians just couldn't do. I mean, that's like your very first commandment of no other God before me. And that wasn't working very well for the Romans. But eventually the numbers of Christians increased so much that the Romans, I mean, they had no choice. The government didn't. There's too many. Sometimes you'd have a Roman city that's 80% Christians. And so Emperor Constantine, you just can't manage that. So Christianity is legalized. And then eventually, 60 years later, 64 years later, you have Theodosius, another emperor, that makes Christianity the official religion of the whole empire. But it wasn't too long after that Rome runs into a lot of social, political, financial, military problems. And a lot of it has to do with there's mass migration due to people being pushed up against the borders of Rome because there's the Huns are fighting, they're taking territories. There's a lot of other warlords outside the empire, and people are trying to flee these battle zones and these war zones, and so they run up against the empire of Rome. Well, initially, the Romans don't want to let them in, because they'd consider them to be barbarians, which for the Romans, what that meant is that the people did not speak the same language as the Romans. They may not necessarily be easy to assimilate. Like Rome conquered a lot of places, but it did it by its own choosing. It picked where it wanted to expand. Well, a lot of these migrants that were there were not necessarily who Rome was going to pick to incorporate in the empire. And so it has to keep spending tons and tons of money to finance its military. And eventually it just gets to a point where Rome cannot continue the western part, or it can't continue to keep back all the so-called barbarians. And the Roman Empire as a unified whole divides into eastern and western portions. And that worked for a while to manage this migration problem that they had. But it wasn't going to last. And eventually the Visigoths, which is one group of supposed barbarians, they sacked the Eternal City of Rome, which was a big event. St. Augustine writes about it in the City of God. And some of the pagan people blame the Christians for this event. That hey, this is before when we were not Christians, the Rome was eternal; it would last forever. The empire was unstoppable. It was undefeatable. But then we become Christians, and all of a sudden the empire falls apart. That's your fault, Christians. Augustine's like, whoa, no, it's not. And he has a lot of argumentation in the very first half of his book to push back on that idea. And if a person's interested in that, they can read Augustine's City of God. But eventually, the Western Empire, it falls, it collapses. But this is something that was a slow motion process. It didn't happen overnight. It's not like it was Rome one day or the Western Roman Empire one day, and then all of a sudden that's no longer the next. No, this happened over a span. This was already happening well before the Christians showed up. Or no, it wasn't before they showed up, but it was like from 200 AD to this 476 AD. There's about 276 years of this decline happening in the empire. It's a slow motion collapse. Well, what happens after the collapse? Well, the Western world is pitched into this, what's sometimes called the Dark Ages. Well, to understand the significance of the Dark Ages, you have to understand what this collapse of the Western Roman Empire actually entailed. That at its peak, the empire, like I said, was the strongest military, financial, legal systems in its domain of control. I mean, Rome was untouchable as an empire. And that lasted a long time from the Republic to the Empire, 800 or more years. I mean, this is very stable stuff. As far as the Romans themselves go, all these people that were being conquered and stuff, not stable at all. But then they're getting consumed by an empire that's expanding, and the empire had laws. It had its legal system. It had structure. It built the road, these roads. It built aqueducts, did a lot of infrastructure projects that brought more financial success, prosperity to various people. I'm not saying that's a good thing to be conquered at all, but Rome brought something with it too. It didn't just demolish everything and then go away. No, it fought, or people gave into it, and then it brought in its governors to manage things, and things changed, and it's like it had a stabilizing effect where it went to. But then, well, what happens? Why did it fall? Well, there's a lot of reasons. And one of the main ones is that is well, there's multiple, but there's a few main reasons. One of them is that its borders were constantly being bombarded with people trying to migrate away from other battles and war zones. Those people wanted to come into the empire. The empire didn't want them to come in. So they had to finance massive military spending to keep out who they didn't want to come in. And they couldn't afford that, while at the same time you have a political class at the top of Rome that started looking more after its own interests than, say, the interest of the empire. That they would make decisions and make sure that they have their cut of the money and the wealth and power and all that. And then what's left they do to the military, and then they start slacking on these various building projects and infrastructure projects. And so this is happening, like I say, over 250 plus years. And eventually they can't afford to pay the well-trained Roman soldiers anymore. And so they start hiring. They say, okay, well, here's this group of barbarians, those who don't speak Latin, but that, okay, maybe we can tolerate this group. We'll let them in right over the border and then pay them a little to defend the border for us. So it's like you let in one group of the migrating people to keep the other groups out. Well, that group didn't necessarily have much loyalty to Rome, especially, or the empire. I mean, they just didn't, and they were not assimilated in the normal way that the empire did things, and then Rome also doesn't have the military capabilities anymore to force the assimilation, and so you have people defending the borders that are not necessarily loyal to the empire itself, and then the empire is not treating them the best on top of that, and then you got a political class that isn't really paying attention to all this stuff. And so you just keep adding these factors together, and eventually it just cannot hold. And there's a video in this week's module that goes into much more detail about it, but that's the gist of why did the Western Empire fall. It financially overextended itself. It militarily couldn't keep back people trying to come in, and then it hired the wrong people to keep people from coming back in. And you keep adding these things up, and eventually, the borders collapse. And then all these groups that have been wanting to come in, they do come in, and then they do things the way they want to. They start dividing out pieces of the empire. And what is it, though, that persists? Like, what is the stationary during this time is Christianity, and it's becoming more as an institution. Like, once the empire collapses in like 476, well, you can see within 120 something years, you have the development of the Roman Catholic Church as an institution. And that's where the only sort of records and stuff, the reason it's called the Dark Ages is because we do not have a lot of written records from the time. Not nearly as much as what we have from the Greeks and the Romans themselves. That it's you have to imagine lots of groups of people that do not speak Latin that are coming in and taking territories, and this is going on during like almost 325 years. And so there's not people sitting there writing big histories of what's happening. There are a few, but the only sort of writing and reading and stuff that was really happening was in these monasteries, these Christian churches, kind of at the very perimeter of where all the action's happening in the center, like where France and Spain and Italy and these places are being overrun and kind of pulled in, by the various groups coming in, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Vandals. All these groups are coming in and taking territories. And so you have 325 years or so of just people trying to establish new domains of control, make a home for themselves and all the people that are coming with them, their tribes. And so 325 years, which is longer than, say, the United States has even existed, of this sort of disorganization with competing warlords. Essentially, the Roman Empire turns into what was already existing outside the empire, where you have different powerful groups vying for positions, and the people that don't have the ability to fight are just trying to move out of the way of the bigger groups that are fighting for control. And so there's just not a whole lot going into writing history when you're just trying to survive and protect your family. But things start to change about in this domain during the time when Charlemagne comes around. And what was Charlemagne initially? Well, he was just a descendant of one of these groups, these so-called barbarian groups, and he happened to be in the domain of France, Germany, that just happened to have more, just kind of the winner of the rat race of who's going to be in charge. And he ends up, he does something, though, that's very significant historically, at least for the Middle Ages and going forward. But when Charlemagne shows up, you exit the Dark Ages and you enter this Middle Ages, medieval period. Well, what is that? Well, the main thing he did is he went to the groups, he would fight the groups that resisted the sort of centralizing of power that he was doing. He'd defeat them. Then he would ally with others. So he fights who he has to fight, he allies with who he has to ally, until eventually he gets a kind of stable structure here, a kind of kingdom, and the ability to sort of enforce a way of life and thinking and political system and legal system on all these other diverse groups. And one of the big things he does is he partners with the church, the Catholic Church. And he does education reform where he brings education back. For those 325 years of the Dark Ages, there's no schools really. There's no institutes of learning. There's not more people being taught how to read and write and do grammar and logic and mathematics and all these things. People are focused on surviving. But he brings that back. And he puts the church becomes in charge of the education of the masses. And all the leaders, the clergy, the lay people, the peasants, eventually they receive their education via these churches in their villages. And if you think of it in more contemporary terms, you're thinking of, like, say, private religious schools and no secular public schools. So everybody that's being educated is not only being educated in how, reading and writing, things like that, argumentation. They're also being educated in the tenets, the Christian spiritual worldview at the same time. And so that spreads Christianity far and wide throughout Charlemagne's, it's called the Carolingian dynasty, that it spreads it as wide as the dynasty and then further and further out. And then so all the people are educated in the essentially Roman Catholic schools. And then it comes up with, well, what is the proper relationship between human reason and faith? That became a topic. Why? Well, because everybody's educated. They're being educated in things like logic and grammar and various things. And so they're being taught how to reason and think. And at the same time, they're being taught the various Christian spiritual worldview. And so people start applying what they're learning on the one hand with reasoning and argumentation to the worldview that they're also being taught at the same time. Can one help the other? That's what they were up to. But you got to keep in mind that this medieval education system, it had like a really grab bag of resources that it was trying to synthesize. That it had not only the Bible, various things like that, and Saint Augustine and Jerome, all these early church, what they call the church fathers, they had those writings because the regardless of the Dark Ages, those things were preserved in the various churches, monasteries out in the borders. But they also had some Greek and Roman authors. But it was a real haphazard collection. Like they had just a piece of one of Plato's works. They had Aristotle, had a pretty good bit of Aristotle stuff eventually. But they also had like Roman stuff from Boethius, Cicero, Seneca. Seneca was a Stoic, and Cicero was a type of Stoic too. And they had Boethius. He was Roman. He eventually had to execute himself out. I'm pretty sure it was Nero that he was friends with, but then it went to pieces. It didn't work out. So you had Roman, you had classical Greek, you had Roman, you had the Christian, you had the Jewish stuff, you had all of that. But it was just bits and pieces of the Greek and Roman stuff. And that didn't always agree with the Christian worldview. Remember things like Plato or Aristotle, that was happening 400, 500, 600 years before Christianity really took hold. And so, I mean, Aristotle's not saying things that are necessarily going to be consistent with the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. So, I mean, they had options. They could have just said, well, these are pagans and we're just going to toss out whatever they say. And whenever that goes against the Christian teachings, well, the Aristotle and them, they're just wrong. Well, they didn't want to do that, though. And it's interesting how this works, that they wanted to incorporate it, that they had a smaller selection of books. They had to work really hard to get these books from classical Greece and the Roman books. And they knew that civilization itself had basically collapsed for all the years of the Dark Ages. And so they knew that these books were worthwhile and valuable. And they did not, and it's history built into them, and they didn't want to throw that away, and they didn't want to believe they could see what Aristotle, for example, could do with logic and reasoning, or even with Plato with the Timaeus, or Seneca and all these others. They knew that these were smart people, they had something to say, and they wanted to try to incorporate it and try to harmonize it. And so they were looking for some way to an explanation to harmonize as much as possible of the classical Greek, the Roman ideas with the Christian ideas. And so they wanted to preserve it, and they wanted to incorporate as much as they could from the astronomy, from the medicine. They wanted all of it to work together within a Christian framework. And you get some really interesting outcome because of that. They develop a whole picture of the universe based off of some Aristotle, some Roman stuff, some Christian stuff. And it's really fascinating the way they tried to create a unified world system of what reality was by trying to piece together and make everything work together. And so, what is the picture of it? Well, you have the Earth as the center of the universe. That was a pretty common thought, even in the Greek days, but it wasn't always there. There were alternatives to this, what they call geocentric view, There were some that did heliocentric, like today, where we're circling the sun. The Earth is going around the sun rather than the sun and everything else going around the Earth. But during this medieval period, it would be geocentrism, where everything's circling around the Earth. The Earth is, in a sense, hovering in the center as the rest of the universe rotates around it. And so, how do you do that? Well, you have the Earth, and then you have this sort of Matryoshka, or Russian doll, nesting doll situation, where you have the Earth in the center, and then you have a sphere around the Earth that the moon is captured in the side of. And then you have other spheres around the sphere of the moon. So think about it like hollow spheres that are invisible, except the actual planets and the moon that are kind of embedded in. And then those spheres are rotating around the Earth. And there's a video in this week's module that has a star trail and time lapse. And what you can see is why this view was not crazy. If you stand outside at night, or better, just find somewhere to kind of lay down and look up and find where the North Star is. And if you can find the North Star, you can find the Southern Star. What you will see is that it very much looks like that from the surface of the Earth, that the stars don't change position relative to each other. They keep the same distances between the stars. And then if you look long enough, you'll notice that there's a rotation happening where it looks like all the stars are going around, say, the North Star. And they're all maintaining their distances. Now, the planets and the moon, they had to have other sort of invisible spheres to explain those, and it didn't work perfectly because you have things like retrograde motion, where you see a planet in the sky at night and it's going to the left, and then all of a sudden it's going to the right, and then all of a sudden it backs up a little bit, then it goes again. There's an entire history of astronomy that's fascinating, of people trying to figure out what's going on with that, in epicycles and all kinds of stuff. But the key to it is to think of the Earth as the smallest nesting doll, and then you have all the other nesting dolls of spheres around it, ever larger, until you get to the actual outer bands, the celestial or heavenly sphere of the stars, and they're circling around the Earth, or it's rotating. So we're inside a sort of hollow spheres, and then they're rotating. Quite interesting. And from the surface of the Earth, it looks plausible, actually. And you can see that video and see that for yourself. And remember, they had no telescopes. They didn't have anything like that at this time. So, they're just using their eye, the human eye, and what it looks like. Well, plausible. But then now comes this Christianity. And so, well, how does this work? How does Christianity enter into? So, this heavenly spheres notion, this is stuff from the Greeks and the Romans. This is Aristotle stuff, Ptolemy stuff. This is not, coming out of the Bible necessarily. But then, so that's their incorporation of the sort of more ancient views of astronomy with the heavenly spheres concept or concept. And then, well, how do they Christianize it? Well, everything below, and this is not necessarily purely Christian either, that everything below the sphere that's trapping the moon and rotating around the Earth, the one closest to us, the moon's closest, well, from anything from below the moon is contingent, it's impermanent, it's changeable, it's not necessary stuff. It's not transcendent. It's the growth and decay and the death domain. Well, then everything beyond the moon, that has a permanence, especially by the time you get to where the stars are. And it's perfect. It's in perfect harmony. It rotates the same way consistently. It's predictable. Whereas on the surface of the Earth, things are unpredictable. They have a random or a chaotic aspect to it. You have wars, you have battles, humans doing all kinds of things to other humans, and there's death, there's dying. Whereas when you look up at the night sky with the stars, that stuff seems forever. And so everything above the sort of earthly domain is permanent, it's perfect, it's the divine, or it is associated with the divine. And remember, there's hierarchies of reality going on here, where in this Christian worldview, where humans and, animals and then the non-living things are at the very bottom tier of reality. But then there's the angels and there's God, and that is more real than what's happening on the earth. And it's more perfect. It's just more better in every possible way. And so what is our position in this? What's the relationship of this cosmic perfection and this earthly imperfection? Well, it's exactly that we are the imperfect creatures, and we should humble ourselves in the face of the larger perfection, the larger impermanence, or permanence. What stays forever is far more significant than what constantly changes every day in the human realm and the earthly realm. And so what we should do, according to the, and this is where it becomes more Christian spiritual worldview, is that you look up at the sky, and that's a good indication that what humans should do is humble themselves before that, follow the path of the perfect of God, and you can't achieve it on this earth, but in a sense, what's happening on this earth is not what matters. It's irrelevant in regards to everlasting life and doing what God wants one to do, what Jesus wants one to do. So the sort of earthly sphere and the human concerns are not of priority in this picture. Yeah. And at this point, that's kind of just a glimpse at this medieval sort of picture of the universe, the cosmos, the human place within it. Well, also, to go back to this notion of what role is the church playing in all this? Well, clearly it's the education system, but it's more than that. And so there's three senses of this notion of church that's worth keeping in mind when you're thinking about the medieval era. Is you have the church that could mean like St. Augustine did, which for him, it just meant the whole body of Christian believers, just the people. Well, then the next way you can think of church is it's a physical location. Like today, we have churches. Well, those are places Christians would go to worship. They're a physical building or a place. They don't have to be. It could be someone's house, but it's got this locational, spatially located sense to it. It's a building. It's somewhere we go. Then the third thing, though, is the most important and becomes very important by the time we get to the Renaissance, is the notion of the church, which is the Roman Catholic Church as not just a spiritual institution, but it becomes a social, political, economic institution as well. And the church, it did so much for organizing what was disordered. It's like, to go back to Charlemagne, he put order back into society after the Dark Ages by essentially being the warlord that won the day in the end. I mean, he wasn't necessarily a warlord, but he fought to establish his rule and the Carolingian dynasty. But it was the church that eventually had the power, not the kings and the queens. That the church was responsible for christening everybody's babies, for doing the marriage ceremonies, for the church kept most of the public records. And obviously the kings and the queens and stuff, they had scribes, they had people writing stuff down, preserving things. But all the big treaties are conducted typically under the purview of the church. And this just keeps increasing as the years go by, where the kings and the queens, they ruled the people inside their territories. In the arrangement, like people may have heard of feudalism, where the kings and queens, they technically own everything, but then the various lords and the ladies, the dukes, the duchesses, all of that stuff, you have this sort of aristocracy that go out there and they are awarded various parcels of land, sometimes generationally throughout their families. And they manage these lands, and on these lands is everybody else. They're the peasants. Some of them are serfs. They can't leave the land. It depends on what kingdom you're talking about. But you have the peasant class of people, the worker class, largely agricultural. And I mean, this is they would have their hunters, they would have their farmers, and I mean, it's a lot of it is surviving. You need the food, but also there's trade deals. Like they had sheep in say England and places like that. And so that's your ordering where the peasants answer to the nobles, the lords, the ladies, then the nobles answer to the king and the queen, and the lords and the ladies they take an oath of fealty that, yeah, king or queen, I will bring soldiers when you need them to defend the realm. I'll support you in your endeavors. And as a reward for that, they get these various lands that have the various peasants living on the lands. And then the peasants work the fields, the lords and the ladies, and eventually the king and the queen. They benefit financially, and the wealth is extracted up from the work of those people into these aristocratic, noble groups of people. Very small group that's ruling over a much larger group. But then this, though, really just becomes a facade for a while, where who was really doing the ruling was the church, because the church was across all the kingdoms. So one way you can think about it is kind of like a federal government versus state government. That's not a perfect analogy because the church had way more power than the current federal government, saying the U.S. has. And the kings and the queens, they had more power and less, depending on which way you're looking at it, in terms of like current state governors and state legislatures. The kings and the queens, they could absolutely create laws and various things, but those things have to, if they go too far out of line with what the church wants, they have to back off. Well, then in the end, the people, well, they're just at the mercy of both groups. But if a king or a queen or a kingdom decided to go against the church, well, they could be excommunicated, the king, the whole kingdom. And that's a fate worse than death, in that most of these peasants, and especially if they've been educated at their local monastery, I mean, they adhere very devoutly to the Christian spiritual worldview and the Roman Catholic version of it at this point in time. And so being excommunicated or stuff, you can't do the necessary rituals like confess your sins. You can't do these things. And so if your king or your queen goes afoul of the church, and then your kingdom is, so the priest and the bishops and all that, they just close the doors. Well, you have no education anymore. That's also where the medical services were largely provided. But more than that, your soul's in jeopardy of eternal damnation. And so that's something that kings and queens couldn't push back on that for a very long time. That it becomes where the church has tremendous power over these kingdoms, where the Pope's word matters more than the king or the queen's word. And it doesn't stay this way, but it is this way for very many years. And but this also brought tremendous stability, in that you have people that all are sharing a sort of singular spiritual religious worldview, and they have the same kind of value system, the same kind of morality system, that everybody kind of knows their place, not just in, I'm the peasant, I work in the field and answer to the lord of the manor, and then the lord of the manor answers to the king, and then the king ultimately answers to the Pope and the church. It's not just that. It's like there is an actual hierarchy in reality, and that everybody knows that ultimately we're still just humans, and so have to be deferential to the divine. And so everybody kind of has this, or most have this sort of view. And so when you're in a sort of monoculture, or a monoculture in the sense of religious spiritual beliefs, you have the expectations, the responsibilities. Everybody kind of knows these things. And so some, of course, will push against it, but the overwhelming majority are not. And so that creates a more historically a stable situation. I'm not saying it's perfect or preferable, whatever. It's just there are some upsides to things like this. Well, so in the Middle Ages, the sort of summary of this is that the Christian spiritual worldview, it reigns supreme. And the Roman Catholic Church is in charge of education. It's got economics. It could do military stuff. If a king and kingdom kind of went off the rails, it could have the other Christian kingdoms come in and depose that king and then get somebody else in there. And so tremendous power. And it was, though, keep in mind that the church's role in education, it still had that approach of, it did not try to throw out these past ideas from the classical Greeks, the ancient Greeks, the Romans. It still tried to incorporate all those things into its picture of reality. And so then that means that, well, that all the educated people are going to be focused on questions that matter to very devout people with a Christian spiritual worldview. Like, does God exist? Can we use our argumentation skills that we're learning in our essentially private religious schools to prove God's existence? Can we work through the problem of evil? Can we work through various things about what is the relationship between God the Father, Jesus the Son, the Holy Spirit, the Trinity? How to work around that? How's all that fixed? Or how can we make that reasonable? Well, that's where we get into the philosophical aspect of this, the proofs for God's existence. For our purposes, just think of it as argumentation, trying to support the claim. It's all directed at supporting the claim that God exists, or God must exist. There's different kind of ways that this was approached. One of the major ways is these ontological arguments. Well, what are those? Well, they're sort of by definition arguments. They're interesting. So you try to develop this really clear, or at least understandable definition or conception of God. And then you say, well, if that's what God is, then what has to follow from it? Does God have to exist given what God is? So it's kind of like, is existence contained in the very definition of what it is to be God? That's how ontological arguments work. You're going from things like, you start with the definition or the concept of God in our minds, then you reason, you think, and you see if you can get to, well, God has to exist given what the definition is. And so one of the examples of this is Saint Anselm. And his arguments, you can read through all these line by line. We're not going to go through each and every argument in this handout, but we will go through some of them. It's like, so by definition, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived or thought. You really have to understand and think about what that's saying to understand what Anselm's doing. So God is the absolute greatest. You can't even think of anything greater than God. That's reason one. Things and entities, etc., that actually exist in reality are greater than things that are merely thought or imagined. So what does that mean? It means that I can have an idea of some fantastical dragon with butterfly wings. I can imagine that. That exists in thought. It's in my mind. Probably in your minds now too, now that I've described it. You probably have an image of such a dragon with butterfly wings. And the idea, though, is that, but that's not as great as if such a thing's actually out in reality. Things that are in reality, things like actual cats, actual trees, actual people, actual houses. If there was an actual dragon, that would be much greater than just my imagined dragon. So that's the idea, is that what we can think of is not as great as something that's actually out in the world that exists independently of whether we think of it or not. It's like you can imagine you walk outside and here's a cat. It's not your cat, it's just a random cat that walked up. Well, you could have been in your house thinking of cats, but then you walk outside and here's a real cat. Well, that cat, you didn't think of it. It was there. It's there in reality. You can try not to think about that cat and it's still there. So it is greater than whatever we can think of, in that it actually exists in the world. So that's what Anselm's trying to get to here, is this notion that things that are actually existing out in the world, the universe and reality, those are greater than the things that are merely thought. Well, for God to be the absolute greatest of all things that can be conceived, God must exist. That if God is, by definition, nothing greater can be thought of, nothing greater can be there, well then, and things just thought is not great. So God can't just be a thought in our heads. For God to be, by definition, the greatest thing that ever is, ever was, ever will be, God has to exist. So by definition, God's existence is contained in the very definition. God must necessarily exist, given that God's the greatest that can ever be. Is that convincing? I don't know. People can think about it. There are people that still work with this in philosophy, religion, theologians. The next thing is, if one carefully thinks about the concept of God, then one discovers that God cannot even be thought as not existing. For if you could think that God doesn't exist, you can use the words. You can contemplate the words in your head. Anselm would say that. Yeah, you can think the words, but can you actually believe it in reality? He'd say, no, you can't. Because if God's truly the greatest of all things, then it's not possible to, if you're going to say that God's the greatest, then you can't think that it could never exist. So if one could think of God not existing, then God would not be than which nothing greater can be conceived. For by his definition, God is that, and that was established by the previous argument. So God must exist, and it's not impossible to think otherwise once one has properly understood the definition of God. So it all comes back to understanding Anselm's definition and really thinking about that, what it means to be the greatest of all. And if you think about that, then keep rereading Anselm's reasoning. There is this is reasonable. It's not crazy. That doesn't mean his arguments are perfect. Doesn't mean you can't challenge them. None of that. It's just that this is not. If a person's inclined to say, "Well, no, I don't buy it," well, the idea is, think about what is it. Where does he go wrong? Which of these steps? Which of these reasons? Say 1 through 3. The conclusion is always marked by the 3 little triangle dots. That's the main claim that these 3 are supposed to be supporting. Which of these 3 are wrong? If you disagree with this conclusion, where's the mistake? That's what that's what I want to emphasize this week, is where has a person made a mistake? If you don't agree with where they end up, they had to have made a mistake in, say, these 1 through 3, these reasons here. And so that's kind of gives you a feel for Anselm. And I give you a more description of how it's working, what the idea infinity is actually lurking behind this notion of greatness. And so you can read through that and get a better feel for what Anselm's trying to do. And then there's cosmological arguments. So what are these things? So ontological arguments, remember, they're always by definition. So we try to create a definition of God that seems plausible, that seems to capture all of these traits of it's the greatest, all powerful, all knowing, all good, all those things we saw last week with the problem of evil. And then once you have that definition, that kind of conception of God worked out, well, does existence have to follow from that? Must God exist? If God were to be all of those things, well, does that by default have to exist? Anselm and ontological arguments would say yes. That's kind of the push of them. Cosmological arguments are different. That you can do ontological arguments just sitting in your armchair. You just think about and craft the definition of God. You can look at a very spiritual text to do so, whatever, but you craft a definition. You don't have to go out and look at the world. That God's existence is based on what God is, and that can be understood in the mind, supposedly. Then you can do every bit of this sitting in the house in the armchair. So it's what's sometimes called armchair philosophizing or armchair reasoning. You don't have to go out in the world and look at a thing. You don't have to know about cats and dogs or whatever. If you have the definition of God, you supposedly can reason your way to God must exist. That conclusion. But cosmological arguments do very differently. They start with very supposedly observable facts about reality. Then, from those observed or experienced reality, they reason you think, then you get to the claim or the conclusion that God exists. So Aquinas is famous for these things. I mean, St. Thomas Aquinas, you can see his years, that he was one of the hardcore scholastics. And he did a lot of his reasonings based on Aristotle. We have not covered Aristotle, but you don't have to understand Aristotle to understand what Aquinas is trying to do in these arguments. So he just starts from various observables. And then you go from the observables, you reason your way down to this conclusion that God must exist. So every day we observe things, events, they move and they change. That seems pretty true, right? I mean, there's stuff that's moving. The dog runs across the yard. We move our hands. We get up. We brush our teeth. You know, that meteors fall out of the sky. Cars are driving down the road. Things are moving. Things are changing. Trees have leaves. They lose their leaves in the fall. There's change happening. Political parties, one rises, one falls. You know, change, movement. So all it is an observation about reality. Every day we observe things, events that change. They're in motion, they change. Well, then, so where do we go from there? Well, that everything that's moved or changed is moved or changed by some other existing mover or changer. Well, that seems plausible. That if you have, if I go outside and the wind blows and then a limb falls out of the tree, well, the wind was the existing mover or changer that pushed on this other existing thing, this limb, that broke and fell to the ground. You know, or so you can think of it in terms of you pick up a ball and you throw it. Well, why is the ball moving? Why did it change position? Because an existing mover or changer, namely us, we picked it up and threw it. So things don't move without something else that's being the mover that exists. Existing things don't move without some other existing thing pushing on them or throwing them or picking them up or whatever. And so, yeah, that doesn't seem too wild. Well, there can't be an infinite series of existing movers and changers. There must exist a first mover or changer. That is potentially the very first sort of controversial thing that Aquinas does in this argument. That he would say that if we observe reality, it always terminates in some original motion. That it's like if you, once again, you can't chase it back and see it, but you kind of assume that it's there. So go back to the wind blowing and the branch breaking. That if we think back in that thing, well, there's something that got those air molecules moving that makes wind. What could that have been? Well, it could have been other winds back there. And maybe it was a butterfly at the far end that just flapped its wings and then eventually turns into the hurricane, that the gust of wind that breaks the limb off the tree. You know, that's the idea, is a butterfly flaps its wings and then a hurricane happens on the other side of the world. Regardless of that, is still, there's an expectation that any motion is going to terminate it's not going to go on infinitely backwards. So it's like if I pick up the ball and I throw the ball, well, where does the start of the ball's motion? Well, it terminates in me. Like I picked it up, I threw it, I'm the end, it's terminated, the source of the motion that was, pushed into causing the ball to move. That's the idea there. But sometimes we might say, well, what if it just goes back forever? Well, this is a sort of Aristotelian assumption that you cannot have what's known as an infinite regress, that things have to run up against some original mover or some original something that got everything else into motion. Like if you take a pool cue and you hit one pool ball or play pinball and you sling the ball out there and it hits all these other things, the idea is you can always chase it back to that original strike to the ball by the cue and the person operating the pool cue, or the initial pull back on the lever and letting go of the steel ball and the pinball machine. There's always this initial termination point of, why did all these other events happen? Well, because of this original, pull of the spring to launch the ball in the pinball machine, or the striking of the first pool ball with the cue done by a human being. And so he would say that that's just the way reality works, is there's never this infinite series. We don't observe that. And so that means there must be or exist a first mover or changer. Well, the only entity capable of being the first mover or changer of all things, say all motion, say if the world and the universe is one giant pinball machine, well, who pulled back the spring and launched the original momentum or the ball to get everything rolling in the entire cosmos? Well, the only entity fit to serve as that would be an all-powerful, all-knowing God. Well, therefore, God must exist. So you see, it's interesting the way cosmological arguments work. Is you start from just everyday things that you observe. Things move and change. That's not controversial. I mean, it could be. Someone like Parmenides, back there with the pre-Socratics, would say, no, motion is just apparent. It's not real. So there are people and philosophy people that could even disagree with that. But if we think just in an everyday sense, that it seems like stuff moves and changes. And it does seem like things that are moved and changed, existing stuff, the ball's thrown, well, we assume, there was some existing person or whatever that threw the ball. Well, then you don't find an infinite series. Then go back to throwing the ball. It terminates the origin of the ball's motion, terminates what got it to moving. Well, me, when I picked it up and threw it. And then when you just, all that Aquinas does is go to 4 and then extend that. Well, then we see that most everything's moving all the time. Well, what could have gotten all of this going? And think back to those heavenly spheres, the rotation of the stars. Like where did that come from? The stars are moving around us, and so when you think at that astronomical scale, you're like, well, what got the heavenly sphere with the stars moving? Well, the only thing that could have been able to do that would be a super all-powerful entity, namely God. In the heavenly spheres, the stars are moving around us. There's no denying the motion, unless you're Parmenides or somebody or Zeno. But it's like you see the motion, and it's like, well, there has to be a mover that's moving that, causing it to move, getting it to do its thing. Well, we can't do that. Us little small-scale humans, we're not moving the stars. So there has to be something greater than us that's moving the stars. And the only thing to conceptualize doing that, well, that would be God. And there's other examples of this with a door opening, so you can read through how that might work. Well, from causes to first causes is very similar. It's a cosmological argument too. It's going to have the same kind of overall structure. Every day we observe causes and effects. Rock is thrown, a window breaks. Arrow is launched from a bow and it sticks in a target. A person pushes the accelerator pedal in a car and the car gains speed. The cause, pushing the accelerator. The effect, the car gains speed. That, we observe these things all day. It's like, you run in the yard and you trip over a rock and you fall. Well, what is the cause of the fall? The tripping over the rock. The effect, you're on the ground now. The fall and you're ending up on the ground. Cause and effect. That's the way he's thinking about it. Nothing crazy complicated about that. So then it's like, well, no thing or event in observable reality causes itself. Everything's caused by something else. I mean, that seems plausible. That it's like, the fall was caused by what? Tripping over the rock. The window broke. Well, why? Because the rock hit it. So it seems like everything that's caused is caused by, and every effect has a cause. Well, then every cause every cause is the effect of a prior or simultaneously existing cause. So you have this chain now moving backwards. So it's like, okay, what caused the fall? Well, that my toe got caught on the rock. And so that caused me to lose my balance and then fall on the dirt. But then what was I doing before? Well, why did I trip over the rock? How did I get there? Well, because I was running in the yard. So the running led up to the trip. The trip is the effect of the running and my toe being in the wrong position, the toe of my shoe. And so you see how you've got a cause causing a cause, like one the trip, like the rock tripping over the rock is the effect of running and then my toe getting hung in the rock. And then, well, why was I running? What caused me to run? Maybe I was running from a bear. So the fear of seeing the bear is what got me to running. So the fear of the bear is what that was the cause of the effect of me running. But then that running and not paying attention and that rock happening to be in the wrong place, that results in the fall. And so you have like cause effect, like every effect can be, causes can be effects of prior causes. So you just go back, it says, but there can't be an infinite series of existing causes either. There must be a first cause. Like go back, that's a lot like that mover that, you keep going back. And in reality, we observe that there's normally a first thing that gets things started. Like when I threw the ball and it goes across the yard, well, then I'm the cause of the ball's motion. Well, the causation terminates with me as far as that ball goes. But then if you do, what is the cause of all things? What brought all of these causes and effects into existence? Well, the only thing that could seem to be fit for that, according to Aquinas, would be God. So you see, it's a similar pattern. Cosmological arguments always start from just observable stuff. Now, this third way, this is one of the most complicated arguments that Anselm has, but it's also one of the most powerful or compelling to a lot of people, because it's interesting. We'll go through it. So every day we observe merely possible beings that exist but don't necessarily have to. So, well, what does that mean? That means that we observe stuff in this contingent reality. Things are born. Like say we have say a pig. We're raising a pig, and then the pig eventually you have say two pigs, and then you end up with a pregnancy, and now there's piglets coming in to the world. Well, say there's 8 piglets. Well, there could have been 7. There could have been 9. There could have been 6 or 5 or 4. That all the piglets, there could have been none. So it could not have existed, but it does. Well, that's more happenstance than that's just merely possible. It's possible that 7 piglets would be born, but it's not necessary that 7 were born. 5 could have been, none could have been. More than 7 could have been born. The fact that there's 7 piglets is just a mere possibility that happened to actualize. It didn't have to be that way, though. And so you can think about that in terms of your own life. Like all of us exist today because of parents that, they engaged in deeds and reproduction occurred, and here we are. Maybe they married, maybe they didn't. Either way, but what if they hadn't? What if they met other people? Well, then there would have been other people that were born and generated and not us. It's like we ourselves are merely possible beings. Like imagine if your mother and father, they didn't marry, or they didn't ever, their paths never crossed. They met other people. Well, they would have had other kids. There would be no you. The genetic material would not have mixed, and it wouldn't be you. It'd be, they could have had others, but not you. So we ourselves are mere possibles. The same applies to worldly phenomena. That say you have a river that runs through a state. Well, it could have been diverted and gone somewhere else. The water will go wherever it was easier for it to go. or wherever it got pushed or shoved, or terrain features. But the river didn't have to be where it is. It could have been somewhere else. So it's merely possible. So this applies to life forms. It applies to worldly features. It's like, say that you have a job right now. Well, that's just a mere possibility too. It's actualized. You have the job, but you didn't have to have had it. Things could have turned out different. Maybe you didn't pass the business that you applied to, or maybe you didn't know the person that helped you get the job. You have friends. Say that hadn't met that person. Well, then they wouldn't necessarily be your friend. You would not have ever known them. So our friendships, our relationships, like the earth itself and all that's happening on it seems to be just mere possible. So every day we observe merely possible beings. All we got to do is look in the mirror. We're merely possible beings. Beings that exist, but they didn't necessarily have to. It could have turned out differently. Hopefully, those examples help you make sense of that. So if we assume that all beings have always been merely possible beings and imagine backwards in time, then at some point in the past, every merely possible being will not have existed. And if we imagine back far enough, we'll reach the moment when no merely possible being existed. Essentially, we'll reach the point when absolutely nothing existed. So sometimes that's hard for people to understand, but just think about it. So just do it through, say, your own genealogy is a way to go with it. Is say that you're merely possible, just the happenstance of your parents meeting, and then you result. Well, then that's the same story for them, that their parents just happenstance met and that they were the result. Well, if you keep going back far enough, you'll reach a point where what? Well, there's no humans. That all these mere possibilities, it hasn't got started yet. So there's no humans. Well, then all the trees that we see, that each tree, each acorn did not have to germinate and turn in and grow up into a tree. It could have been eaten by a deer wandering by, but it made it. Now maybe it's a 400 or 500 year live oak tree. But the idea is you can keep going back to a time before there were trees, before there was the acorn. You can do it with chickens. Every single chicken egg may or may not turn in, be incubated enough to turn into a chicken or have the right genetic makeup or whatever. And so you just keep going backwards with all these things. And eventually you get to a point where, well, what would be if all the merely possibles have not yet actualized? What do you get? Well, nothing. Absolutely nothingness. Because everything that's possible has not yet gotten started. So you have absolute nothingness. Nothing's merely possible. There's no existing anything. There would be no thing, nothing. But then Anselm would say, but there can't be a moment when absolutely nothing existed. This is clever. That can't be. Well, why? Because there's clearly lots of somethings today. There's merely possible beings, tons of them. We're that. Everything else we see is existing in current reality. And they couldn't have originated from nothing. From nothing comes nothing. That if you have absolutely nothing, you don't get somethings out of it. Not mere possible somethings, not mere anything. From absolutely nothing, imagine just a absolute vacuum with no molecules, no motion, just nothing. Well, that doesn't turn into something, does it? Well, if that's the case, if from absolutely nothing, nothing comes out of it, well, then there had to be something from the very start. Otherwise, it would just continuously be nothing. It's pretty neat. Thus, there must have been a time in the past when there was a necessary being. A being that necessarily had to exist. There had to be something that could not have been mere possible. Because remember, with the mere possibles, we can always think backwards to when there were none of those things. We can think back to a time when there were no humans. At least in our minds, we can think back to when there would be no cats. We can think back to when there would be no fish, when there would be no mountains, when there would be no earth. We can keep going back and back and back. Maybe we can think back to, maybe the time when there was no sun in our solar system, no other planets. Our solar system didn't even exist. I mean, it didn't have to exist. We know, so, at the time of Anselm, they didn't have any conception of stars supernovaing or coming into being or anything like that. To them, the stars were eternal. But that doesn't matter. You can still push them in our contemporary time, even push that back. Well, they're the time before the stars. Well, what you end up with is, given the fact that there are things today, something has to come from something else. Something cannot come from nothing. So what that means is there had to be something that kicked all of this off. It had to exist. Necessarily, there had to be something in existence from the very start. Otherwise, there would be no somethings now. I mean, what's the alternative? Starting with nothing? Well, we've already established that from nothing comes nothing. So there had to be something at the very start of all things. That had to actually be real. It had to exist. According to Anselm, or Aquinas here. So it couldn't be a merely possible being. So the only being capable of being a truly necessary being? Well, that's God, according to Aquinas. So God must have existed, and continue to exist. So and you can read through the description here and imagine backwards. But it all turns on that notion that if everything we see is merely possible, and we can imagine a moment way back when none of the mere possibles existed, and we end up with total nothingness, well, then that can't work, because there is something today, and something has to come from something else. Something cannot come from nothing. So that means there had to be something from the very beginning that contained all that was needed to bring about all these other somethings. Well, the only entity capable of containing all that could have turned into everything we see, according to Aquinas, that would be God. Therefore, God necessarily had to exist. God was a necessary being, not a mere possible. That's why supposedly we, in the contingent realm under the heavenly sphere of the moon and all the rest of the spheres, that's why, we can never compete with the divine, because we're just mere possibles, and it's necessary. It's interesting. You see how the humility's built into the thing. Then there's from this more or less to the absolutely perfect maximum. This is based off comparative judgments. And you can read through it. I won't go into that because I want to get to some of these others, but you can read through it. And there's examples, explanation of it. Now, where this goes, though, is this Samuel Clarke's cosmological argument, which I've included a piece, a PDF file with the core of it is included in this week's module. And this is a sort of retooled, reimagined sort of Aquinas third way. It's inspired by Aquinas' third way. And Samuel Clarke adds some stuff to it, which is quite interesting. Is that, okay, every day we observe and interact with lots of somethings. Ourselves, cats, dogs, other people, all this stuff. We observe and interact with lots of somethings. So lots of things exist. That's really what one is saying. When we observe it, we interact with it. 2, all of the past and current somethings could not have originated from or been caused by absolutely nothing. That sounds familiar, right? From Aquinas' third way. From absolutely nothing comes absolutely nothing. Remember that vacuum with no molecules, no motion, absolutely nothing. I mean, even that ain't even a vacuum. There's nothing. All of these somethings had to have necessarily originated from, been caused to exist, etc., by something else. Therefore, there must have been a necessary pre-existing something at the very beginning, from the start of eternity itself. That sounds basically like what Aquinas is getting at. But Clarke adds more. He said there are 2 major options. That on the one hand, what could have existed? So assuming there had to be some necessary something out there. Well, the person might say, hey, whoa. But with Aquinas, it's like, but that didn't necessarily have to be God, did it? Could have been something else. Okay, let's say I assume that there had to be some starting point with something to get all the other somethings that we see today in existence. Why think that has to be God, though? Well, this is where Clarke's, add-ons make a difference. And he says your two major options is you could say, okay, from the very beginning, the necessary being that got all that we are encountering today in play, that it could be one unchangeable and independent being from which all other things that are or ever were in the universe have received their original. A being that created or contained all the needed stuff and caused or originated all the somethings that came after. So that would be your God option right there, option A. Or there's option B. What if there's just been an infinite succession of changeable and dependent beings produced one from the other in an endless progression without any original causes at all? So that's your option that's sort of like your successions of Big Bangs option, if you bring it into the contemporary times. One of the theories is like, okay, so all this got started with a Big Bang, right? There was a moment of this infinitesimally small matter and stuff compressed to the point that all of a sudden it just explodes out. And then all the dust creates the stars, the planets, the proteins that make the life. Standard Big Bang story. Well, then someone can ask, but what caused the Big Bang? Well, then one theory is, that Big Bang was the end result after trillions and trillions and trillions of years of all the material from the previous Big Bang settling and then being pulled back together into this infinitesimally small thing that reaches a critical point and it explodes outward. It bangs outwards. Well, so you have the most recent Big Bang that would have brought all us to be. Well, then it was caused by what? Another Big Bang. And what caused that Big Bang? Another Big Bang. And so you have this into infinity. Just Big Bang after Big Bang after Big Bang after Big Bang, just on and on and on, all the way back. And so that's your other option. You could say, yeah, there was always something, but it just went into infinity of Big Bangs. You don't have to have a divine being. There's total physics here. Well, okay, so those are your options. Someone could say you have this one unchangeable independent being that had contained all that was necessary to create and maintain everything that we see today. Or you could have this infinite series of changeable dependent beings, which would be like Big Bangs. The Big Bang is change, it's things are all compressed and they smash apart, or they expand apart and then they contract back together and then expand apart again. Think about breathing. Expansion, contraction, infinitely into a long series of those things. So that would be your other option. Well, for the sake of argument, let's assume that option B is true. Let's assume that it's this infinite series of Big Bangs. That's what brought all of what we see, all the somethings in ourselves about. Assume that the necessary pre-existing something from which all past and present somethings have originated, been caused by, was nothing more than an infinite succession of Big Bangs. Hapless particles, beings, events crashing, bashing into one another, etc. None of which was absolutely necessarily existent in and of itself. Like, for example, one Big Bang is merely possible. It didn't have to happen, but it did. So even the bang itself is a merely possible thing. Just one merely possible something causing, crashing into, bashing, banging outwards into another merely possible something from the current moment infinitely backwards in time. An endless progression of one merely possible X causing another merely possible Y, crashing, causing yet another merely possible Z, infinitely backwards in time. So just imagine an infinite series of expanding, contracting Big Bangs. If that helps you to understand what's going on in the argument. So then it's like, okay, well, if option B is true, if that infinite series of bangs is true, then the whole infinite progression of entirely dependent causes particles would by default not be a necessary existence. How could it? For that long chain of merely possible stuff can't ever add up to a necessary anything. That's Clarke's move there, is to say that, okay, if you got this long chain of merely possible Big Bangs, well, none of them are necessary in and of themselves, and this infinite series itself is not necessary. But remember, we already established you have to have something necessary, that you can't get necessity out of a long chain of merely possibles. There has to be something in the start that grounds all the things that come after what was necessary can be totally merely possible. But that origin, that there has to be that origin point. It cannot be infinite. Even if it was infinite, you can say, but couldn't it have been otherwise? Couldn't it have been that there was not this infinite series of Big Bangs? Sure, there's another option. I mean, there could have been one unchangeable thing. So, an infinite series of Big Bangs is not necessary in and of itself. But remember, up there in those earlier reasons, it was established that something had to be necessary. So, this cannot be true, according to Clarke. That infinite series stuff just won't work. It must be false. Moreover, and perhaps most importantly, in order to assume that option B is true, one must also assume it's possible for something to exist without ever being caused by anything else. And this is the big problem with an infinite series of, say, Big Bangs, is that if the whole chain of Big Bangs is itself merely possible, well, that means it had to be caused by something. That unless someone wants to say that if you come up with an infinite series of something that goes on for eternity in both directions, in a cause and effect, I mean, that's the idea, is we're dealing with causes and effects of stuff. Well, there had to be a starting cause. You don't get an effect without a cause. So even an infinite series, even though it's infinite, which by definition means it never started. It has no start. Clarke's not going to let one get away with that. Clarke's going to say, yeah, but that's not the reality we live in. Remember, this is a sort of cosmological argument. It has to be based on observables. And what we observe, there's always a cause to things. There's no causeless effects. And so an infinite series of Big Bangs, it had to get started from somewhere. It's like the infinite series itself is impossible, according to Clarke, if we go by just what we observe in reality. That we can sure in math say there's infinite lines. We can draw our little sideways laid over 8 infinity symbol. We can say, yeah, sure, there's infinity. We can do math formula and calculations with it. But in reality, we've never seen infinity. That we've never seen anything infinite. We've never seen where there's a successive chain of cause and effect that just never terminates anywhere. There's nothing that causes it. Well, Clarke's going to do that same maneuver and say, well, you're going to say, okay, there's this infinite series of Big Bangs. And you say, well, what caused the infinite series? Well, nothing. And Clarke's going to say, but whoa, nothing can't cause anything. From nothing, you get nothing. You had to have something that causes something else. And so the very notion of an infinite progression or series of events, the infinite's the problem. That Clarke's going to deny that that's even possible. And so if that's not possible, well, then that only leaves us with option A. If option B don't work, then option A must be true, which is you have this prior existing creator, originator, first causer of all the past and present somethings that was and is one unchangeable and independent being from which all other beings are and ever were in the universe have received their start, their original. And so there had to have been this entity, this one unified thing that contained all of everything that released it, created it, or if it's all powerful, it had the ability to create something from nothing. Remember, all powerful can do that. That's fine. But only God or divine being is ever thought to have that power. That's a divine power. So you had to have something that was absolutely necessary, that itself was not changed by anything, that brought about all the change we see. Even if it was a succession of Big Bangs, they could not have been caused by nothing, because nothing can cause nothing. It had to be caused by something. So you're still, even that, you see, it still pushes you back to having to think about, well, unless you want situations where there is effects with no causes, unless someone can figure out how to argue for that, effects, but there's no cause to it. Something happened, but nothing caused it. And Clarke and Aquinas both are always going to go back that nothing brings about nothing. You don't get something from nothing unless you're a divine being that's all powerful, and then you can do that. But at that point, they've won the argument. So either way, this argument has definitely been one that people have spent a lot of time looking at. It's interesting. So we can move forward just to finish this video out. There is, of course, these intelligent design arguments. Aquinas does a version of this in his Fifth Way. But the key to an intelligent design argument is the way they work is you observe these patterns and systems in reality, these complexities. Then you reason and you think, and you get to this intelligent God, intelligent designer exist. And just to summarize, how do intelligent design arguments work? Well, you can approach them from two different ways. The more contemporary way that a lot of the theorists and the philosophy people and other science people that argue for intelligent design, the way they do it is they typically show how the alternative to intelligent design, or at least a supposed alternative to it, just doesn't work to explain what it's supposed to explain. Well, that would be your sort of Darwinism picture, is that supposedly, you got a random chance that, of natural selection, that which is most able to adapt survives, has more babies, makes more of itself. And that's supposed to be an origin of the species. How did we start from a primordial goo in a pond on Earth, supposedly, and then end up with humans and zebras and birds? And how did we get this diversity of species from a singular origin point? That's what Darwinian evolution is supposedly an explanation for. Well, the contemporary way of intelligent design arguments is to say, yeah, okay, well, let's assume that's true. Can that explain all this complexity that we observe, like the internal workings of the cells, the internal workings of little viruses and bacteria? And the contemporary intelligent design advocate will say, no, Darwinism does not account for that. It can't. The random stuff, biological systems are too sophisticated to have all just piled together by happenstance. And of course, the defenders of Darwinism come back and they're still working that out. There's books written last year, this year, still on that topic. But that's the new way of approaching sort of intelligent design. The prior way of doing it is to just go by like Aquinas does here, but even more straightforward than Aquinas is someone like Paley. That Paley would say that we detect, so they work from observable reality too. This is not just in our heads. Like, these arguments depend on finding something in the world to point to. And so the idea is, within nature and reality, we detect various parts that are arranged in various interactive configurations that produce results that the individual parts in isolation from one another would not have otherwise produced. So we can look inside a mechanical watch, a car's transmission, the source code of a completed computer program. I mean, he wouldn't have said this because he's in 1700s, but it's the same idea. It's just look at any mechanical thing that or electronic that's created by humans, and if you look inside it, you will see pieces that did not have to be arranged in the ways they are, but given that they are arranged in specific ways, there's results that come out that those parts independently wouldn't have done. So someone that's familiar with computer software, just think you have variables, you have functions, you have in some things objects, which is just a code container that does things. That you can refer to and put inputs in, and it does something as outputs. You have all these pieces. You have your logic stuff, your ands, your ors, your if-then structures. All those things can be arranged in a near infinite seeming amount of ways. But if they're arranged in just the right way, you get something like, say, a PDF viewer. You get like Google as a search engine. That you think of the source code that makes these programs, it's a result the product of a very intelligent process. It took a lot of mental energy and a lot of purposeful stuff to get Windows operating system or the Mac OS system. It took lots of years and lots of effort of lots of intelligent creatures, humans in this case, to come up with what we find if you look at the source code of, say, Mac OS or Windows operating system. Or anything, even something simple like some calculator app on your phone. There was some person, if you look at the code that makes that up, and you can see the source, it'll be written in a computer language, Python, C, C++. It could be Ruby. It could be all kinds of things. And the idea is the parts of that computer language are arranged in certain purposive ways to get the result that you have a calculator app on your phone. Those parts didn't just fall together happenstance and then you have a calculator app. No, people took those parts and arranged them in very particular ways. And then the end result, when those sentences are are interpreted down into binary and then fed through a processor, that you get the calculator app GUI, the graphical interface on the screen, and then the functionality behind the GUI. And so if you look at that code, you can see that this wasn't done by accident and happenstance. Well, that's the same if you look inside a mechanical pocket watch, which is what Paley used, the high technology of his day, the most intricate device. You look at it and you see that these parts, all these gears and springs and cams and escapements and all that, these wheels on wheels, that stuff didn't have to be put in that way. That didn't just fall into the watch case and then all of a sudden you got a watch that keeps the time. No, we know if we find a watch and look inside that this didn't happen by accident. This was purposive. This was designed by an intelligence. And he would say, well, if you look in nature, you see exactly the same thing. That if you open up an animal and you see all the organs that work in these very dependent ways, and that those ways don't seem to have had to have been, it's like it could have been that there'd be no heart in this creature, like if you're dissecting a frog, or no lungs, or no kidneys, or no whatever, no spinal column. But yet it is. And when all those things are together working in the ways they are, you have a very sophisticated thing. And he's like, well, if we think there's an intelligence if we were to find a watch, why wouldn't we think the same thing when we open up the frog or ourselves and look inside? Or when we look at the structure of trees? It's like when we peer at the cell under a microscope, there's a lot of complexity going on. And it seems like the further down you look, the more complexity there is. And it's like, so are we supposed to believe that it's all just fell together that way over eons of time? Or do you just do the more simple move and just say, well, yeah, it looks like that didn't happen by chance, so it didn't happen by chance. That's the idea behind pretty much all intelligent design argumentation. It's interesting. It's worth thinking about. Now, this sort of stuff here, this shows up throughout the Middle Ages. It also shows up in contemporary times. This notion of objective moral values and duties. There's a lot lurking under these two little reasons. But it's like if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties wouldn't exist. But objective moral duties and values do exist. God must exist. What's going on there? We'll start with observables, that there's a lot of people that do indeed believe that certain behaviors are right or wrong, good or bad, good, evil, whatever. There's lots of people on this planet that think that. Well, what grounds that? The situation would be, it can't just be merely human. That the feel to it, the intuition behind it is too much. Like if we see some helpless child walking along, and then somebody else comes along and just smacks the kid in the head and throws him on the pavement and then laughs and stands over him laughing as the kid's crying, there's many of us that are instantly going to be like, there's something terribly wrong happening here. Well, where does that come from? That terribly wrong. Is that solely because we were raised to think that? Some would say yes, that's all it is. But is it? Because is it going to just be, oh, we're raised to think that way if it's your child? Do you get angry as a parent because you were trained to get angry as a parent when your child's done dirty? Or do you get angry as a parent when your child's done dirty because there's something much deeper causing you to get angry? It's just keep thinking along those lines. Put yourself right in the window of this, and think in terms of what is the source of the moral offense, or when we see something that just seems overwhelmingly good and kind, and we react in a positive way to it. Is that all mere training through society, or is there something much deeper there? That this notion of conscience, or a moral intuition, or a sense of right and wrong, goods and bads. Is there something far more deeper going on there? Some would say there has to be. And that is what? Well, someone like Augustine or Aquinas or Anselm, the medievals, and Augustine's kind of pre-medieval, they'd say, well, that's God. And then if you read things like the Bible, it talks about conscience. That's God telling you, hey, don't do that. Do this instead. So that's kind of the way this argument, what it's leaning on, is that that if God didn't exist, there wouldn't be those things, these moral values, these rights and wrongs, goods and bads that matter to people. People fight wars over these things, and money and other things too. But the idea is sometimes people do fight because it's just an offense that cannot go unanswered because it was wrong. An overwhelming sense of the wrongness of what was done. And then war comes about. Or an overwhelming sense of a duty to protect. That you could have a leader of country that's like, I have to protect my people. That's the only right option I have. Not just because I'm a leader, but because that's what, as a human in a leadership position, that's what's expected of me on a cosmic scale. And so if that stuff exists, the claim is that if God didn't exist, that stuff wouldn't exist. Therefore, God has to exist. That's the way the maneuver works. I'm not saying it's the best rendition of it, of the argument, but that's kind of the idea, is you get no morality and ethics without God. Now, the wager, I'm going to let people just read through this because this video is getting a little long, but there's Pascal's wager. It's really interesting how it works. You can pick it to talk about in this week's discussion. There's a description of how it works. But this argument is more a case, we're getting into where it's not so much that God necessarily has to exist with Pascal's wager as it is that it's the best bet to place. That if you got a wager, you stand to gain everything if you believe that God exists. You stand to lose everything if you don't, and circumstances turn out that God does exist. So the better wager, if one's a gambler, is to believe that God exists. The effectiveness argument is a sort of socio argument, which you see this happens too sometimes in the Middle Ages, and it goes forward, especially in like the Enlightenment stuff. You see this kind of argument a lot of times, or before it or during it, that human societies are more stable when they have these various objective moral duties and things that people believe in. They do their best to live in accordance with it. Well, one of the most effective ways to get humans to accept live in accordance with various objective moral values and duties is to have a divine being, have God. So thus the most effective way is regardless of whether God exists or not, for just social cohesion and function, it's better for people to believe that God exists. Now, there's other things. There's a video inside this week's module with this Lysol about the secret code of creation. It's interesting. It uses this math formula and generates all these patterns. I'll let people watch that. Certainly worth thinking about. You can talk about it in this week's discussion if you want to. And then there's the reports of conscience, miracles, various things. Argumentation like this has been around all the way back. is that we have so many reports by so many people of miraculous events, divine experience, their intuitions, their conscience, all those things. If we piled all that up, we would have way more reports of the divine than we would things like black holes or big bangs or whatever. So why not give the most belief to what has the most evidence or the most reports? If there's more reports for the existence of a divine, and if historically, if you go all the way back to the very first religious stuff and spiritual ideas, that goes way further back than the last 400 years of contemporary science. So there's just more evidence if you want to say that verbal reports of events. I mean, there's whole, spiritual religious texts from the Bible to the Quran to the Eightfold Path with Buddhism to the stories of Vishnu and Hinduism, all that. There's so much more of people and billions of people now and in the past that would make reports about some sort of divine something, whereas human science has only been kicking around for 350, 400 years in the sense of scientific method style science. And it makes a lot of big claims. Like scientific method-based science has relativity theories, black holes, superstrings, dark matter, dark energy, quantum gravity, all these things that we don't see dark matter, don't see dark energy looking for effects of it. But the idea is they would say and build papers and be very certain and try to provide all kinds of claims about this stuff. And people are listening to it, buying the books. Oh, that's interesting. All this stuff. But then they would turn away from all the other reports. Like, does that make sense? And that's what that kind of argumentation does. And so, quest for truth, simple enough. Does any of this stuff seem true? Has any of this reasoning or any that you read, does it send one more in the direction of God or a divine existing? If so, then the medieval style argumentation has been quite successful. If not, then you can work with it in discussion and say, why not? Give your own reasons. The final thing is in this bibliography, there's lots of books and stuff, especially some of the stuff about medieval technology that it's worth. If you have the time, you're interested in what was technology like, where, and the sources for various things that are talked about in this video, by all means, check out some of the stuff in the bibliography. But for now, we are done with this video. I look forward to seeing what people have to say in the discussion. Until then.